Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we start this evening, I'd like to make a few announcements that typically occur at the end of the podcast, which is a little pointless, since the whole point of this podcast is to put you to sleep before you get to the end. First, if you're ever interested in reading these works for yourself, you'll always find a link to a free ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show description. The show description also includes links to a number of ways you can support the continuation of this podcast, including subscribing on Patreon, buying me a coffee, or purchasing merchandise through Teespring. Everything helps keep this podcast going, and I hope you'll take the time to check them out. Finally, if you'd like to connect, you can do so on our website, www.boringbookspod.com, or on Twitter at boringbookspod. I'd love to hear from you. Now, let's get to the reading. This evening, we're reading The British Navy Book by Lieutenant Colonel and Brevet Colonel Cyril Field, RMLI, with full-page illustrations in color and in black and white, and numerous illustrations in the text. Published in 1915 by Blackie & Son Limited, London, Glasgow, and Bombay. Let's begin. Publisher's note. Just as this book was about to go to press, an Admiralty order was issued forbidding the publication of any text or illustrations likely to prove of service to the enemy. Proofs of the British Navy book were submitted to the Admiralty, with the result that the book has been approved. Acting in accordance with instructions from the Lords Commissioners, we have substituted other illustrations for those more recent ships previously chosen to represent the Great War by Sea. Blackie & Son Limited. The British Navy Book. Chapter 1. A Lesson from Caesar. Whenever we want to find out anything about the early history of Great Britain, we have almost invariably to turn to the writings of our old friend Julius Caesar. In attempting to trace the beginnings of the Royal Navy, that magnificent organization whereon, under the good providence of God, the wealth, safety, and strength of the kingdom chiefly depend, we have to conform to the same rule and consult this authority. From Caesar's De Bello Gallico, we learn that in his time the ancient Britons made use of boats with a wooden frame, supporting wickerwork instead of planking, and rendered watertight by a covering of skins. Just such boats, in fact, though probably larger, as under the name of coracles, are used to this day on the Wye and some other rivers and estuaries. The portability and rapid construction of these boats commended them to Caesar's military eye, and later on, in one of his continental wars, he ordered his soldiers to make some light boats in imitation of those he had seen in Britain, in order to carry his army across a river. But though Caesar especially mentions these vessels, he does not say that the British of his day had no other or larger vessels. Though they made use of hides and wicker, they must have known something of wooden vessels. There is no doubt that they or their ancestors had large dugouts, hollowed from huge trunks of trees in the same way as Robinson Crusoe constructed his famous boat. We know this because many of these have been discovered buried in the mud of our rivers. One of them, found in the bed of the Rother in 1822, was 60 feet in length and 5 feet wide. Others have been found in Lincolnshire, Scotland, and Sussex, though none of them was nearly as long as the Rother boat. We must remember, too, that the Phoenicians had traded to Cornwall for tin, probably for centuries, and the Britons must have been familiar with their comparatively advanced types of shipbuilding. But many writers on naval matters are of the opinion that our British ancestors, whose coracles are described by Caesar, had even at that time really stout and formidable ships. The reason is this. The Veneti, a race who inhabited western Brittany and the country at the mouth of the Loire River, were a kindred race, and when attacked by Caesar received assistance from Britain. Now the strength of the Veneti seems to have been in their ships, which gave the Roman galleys considerable trouble, and it seems more than likely that the British assistance they received came in the form of a squadron of similar vessels. According to Caesar, the ships of the Veneti were built and fitted out in this manner. Their bottoms were somewhat flatter than ours, the better to adapt them to the shallows and to sustain without danger the ebbing of the tide. Their prows were very high and erect, as likewise their sterns, to bear the hugeness of the waves and the violence of the tempests. The hull of the vessel was entirely of oak, to withstand the shocks and assaults of that stormy ocean. The benches of the rowers were made of strong beams about a foot wide, and were fastened with iron bolts an inch in thickness. Instead of cables, they used chains of iron, and for their sails utilized skins and a sort of thin, pliable leather, either because they had no canvas and did not know how to make sailcloth, or more probably because they thought that canvas sails were not so suitable to stand the violence of the tempests, the fury and rage of the winds, and to propel ships of such bulk and burden. It is evident that these ships were for that period quite up to date. They were strongly built and iron bolted, and had already discarded hempen cables for iron ones. Above all, they were specially constructed to battle with the heavy weather of the Bay of Biscay and the North Sea, and to take refuge from its fury in the rivers and creeks of the western coasts of Europe. The Roman galleys, relying principally on their oars, and therefore comparatively long and light, were not so seaworthy in northern waters. And the same difference in construction between the ships of the Mediterranean and those of the northern nations may be traced right down to comparatively modern ages. One gets very bad weather in the Mediterranean at times, notwithstanding its traditional blue skies and sapphire seas, but the big Atlantic rollers are absent. These ships of the Veneti proved a tough morsel for our old school acquaintance, but his generalship was equal to the task of overcoming them in the end. As he says, in agility and a ready command of oars, we had the advantage, for the Veneti trusted entirely to their sails. But against that, the beaks of the Roman galleys could make no impression on the stout timber of the enemy's ships. They were at a special disadvantage in bad weather, and the bulwarks of the Venetan ships towered so high above their heads, even when they erected their fighting towers, that the Roman soldiers could not hurl their darts on board them, while the Venetan enemy showered their missiles down upon their heads. For the same reason, they found it almost impossible to grapple with and make fast to the big ships, and so carry them by boarding. However, there are more ways than one of killing a cat, and so the Venetans found to their cost, for the Romans, fastening sharp hooks or sickles on the end of long poles pulled alongside, hook them over the halyards of their yards and sails, and rowing away for all they were worth, contrived to cut them through, when down came the yards, and the Venetan vessels became unmanageable. To make matters worse, when a flat calm fell, they could not get away to their hiding places on the coast, and the Romans obtained a complete victory, probably by boarding and fighting at close quarters, when their armor and discipline would tell heavily in their favor. It is interesting to note, by the way, that according to Vigetius, a 15th century writer on naval and military matters, they painted their scouting vessels blue, masts, sails, and all, and dressed their crews in the same color. He adds that Pompey, after defeating Caesar, called himself the son of Neptune, and affected to wear the blue or marine color. As for the Veneti, we may perhaps regard them as the original blue jackets, Veneti being the plural of the Latin venetus, bluish or sea-colored. We have now to pass over a gap of several hundred years, during which time there is little or no information available about the ships belonging to these islands, the greater part of which had become a province of the Roman Empire. There seems to have been a classis Britannici, or British squadron, but this was entirely a Roman organization, and had as much to do with the north of France or Gaul as Britain. The remains of an old ship, just the keel and lower ribs, which were not long ago unearthed on the right bank of the Thames just below Westminster Bridge, are considered likely to have belonged to a galley of this squadron, and we know that there was a legion of what we may term British Marines who formed the fighting portion of the fleet. Tiles have been found at Dover and other known stations of the Romano-British fleet, which bear the following inscription, CLBR, which the experts in such matters interpret as standing for Glaciari Britannici, that is to say, British troops trained for sea warfare. We are also told by Vigetius, the old writer I have already quoted, that the badge of these troops was a circle, which, by the way, is a somewhat curious coincidence, since that of the Marines of our own day is a globe. These were the men who defended the shores of our island against the growing number of pirates from northern Europe. For the rowers of the Roman galleys were merely the machinery of propulsion, and were probably much less considered than the steam engines of a modern battleship. These troops also manned part of the wall built from the North Sea to the Solway, in the vain attempt to keep out the Picts and Scots, for traces of them are to be found at Bo'ness at its western end. The North Sea pirates, then generally referred to as Saxons, became such a menace that the East Coast received the name of the Saxon Shore, and a count was specially appointed to take charge of its defense. In AD 410, the Romans, attacked by the northern nations in their own country, finally abandoned Britain. The British, who had been practically a subject race for nearly 400 years, could make no head against the fierce Picts and Scots, who at once took advantage of the withdrawal of the Roman garrison and swarmed into the north of England. In desperation, the British king, Vortigern, offered to buy the assistance of two Jutish or Saxon pirates, Hengist and Horsa, who were doing a little raiding on their own account on the southern coast. They drove off the northern invaders in accordance with the bargain that was struck, but returning home for more of their Danish and Saxon fellow countrymen, came back and gradually got the country into their own hands. According to another theory, many colonies of Saxons had been established on the east coast during the time of the Romans, and it was the special business of the Count of the Saxon Shore to rule over them. However this may have been, England became a Saxon country, the remnant of the Britons being driven into Wales and Cornwall. Now the Scandinavian peoples were at this time the finest sailors in the world. The Jutes and Angles from Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein belonged to this race, the whole of which became known as Vikings, that is to say, the sons of the creeks, from the Scandinavian word vik, a bay, creek, or fjord. But though there must have been a strong Viking element among the Saxon conquerors of England, so much so that it became known as Angleland, or England, from the Angles, yet the Saxons or English do not seem to have taken so enthusiastically to the sea as the Norwegians and Danes, and except when special efforts to create fighting fleets were made by King Alfred and Edmund Ironside, were never able to prevent the incursions of their Danish and Norse kinsmen, who, in process of time, firmly established themselves in the country. After the Danes came the Norman conquest, and during all this period there was little, if any, change in the types of the ships in which the northern nations fared the seas. What were these vessels like? As it happens, we really know more about them than we do of any between their time and the days of Henry VIII, for not only have we very definite details of them and their gear in the long sagas or historical and traditional poems which have come down to us, sculptured pictures of them in stone, engravings on rocks and upon arms and ornaments, but more than one of the actual Viking vessels has been dug out of the big burial mounds where they have been hidden for centuries. For the Viking chieftain loved his ship, He lavished ornament and decoration upon it, and regarded it almost as a living thing. When, therefore, the time came for him to take the long last voyage from which no man ever returns, it was quite natural that he should have wished to make it in the cherished dragon ship, or long serpent, which had so often borne him over the waves on his way to those hand-to-hand combats and harryings and plunderings in which his soul delighted. Sometimes a funeral pyre was erected on the ship herself, and with his favorite sword by his side, his shield and his helmet, the dead chieftain set out on his final voyage, his sons and followers watching the well-known longship sailing into the west, till she, her sails, and her dead captain disappeared in clouds of fire and smoke under the sunset. Or again, a dying sea king would elect to be buried in his favorite ship, in some spot overlooking the glassy fjord whence he had so often set out on his piratical exploits. The ship was run up on shore over the rollers which all Viking vessels carried to facilitate beaching. The body was laid amidships with his most treasured earthly possessions. A penthouse of timber was built over him. His favorite horses were killed and placed round the hull of the vessel, and the whole was buried in the depths of a huge mound which was erected over it. The most famous finds of this kind were at Gokstad in South Norway in 1881, and at Needham in Schleswig in 1863. In the latter case, the ship does not seem to have been used as a sarcophagus, but with another, which had almost entirely rotted away, was found in a bog. Possibly, if the huge oval mound now utilized as a cemetery at Inverness, and known as Tomnahurik, the Hill of the Fairies, were tunneled into, another Viking ship might be brought to light. In the case of the Needham ship, Roman coins found on board fix her date as being somewhere around AD 250. Both from these ships and fragments of others that have been found in various places, it is abundantly evident that their builders were as skilled shipwrights as ever existed. Space does not allow us to go into details of their construction, but we may say at once that their finish was perfect, and that their lines were not only beautiful, but wonderfully well adapted for contending with the stormy waters of the northern seas. Neither of them appears to have belonged to the largest type of Viking ships, which may be roughly divided into dragon ships or drakars, as Senecas or long serpents, and skutas or small swift scouting vessels. It seems just possible, by the way, that our modern slang expression scoot, get away quickly or clear out, may be derived from this word. We must try in the next chapter to understand what these Viking ships were like. Chapter 2: Ancient Warships. If we take the dimensions of the actual Viking boats that have been unearthed, as I have related in the last chapter, we shall have an excellent foundation upon which to form an idea of the bigger and more important ones. Now the Gokstad boat is nearly 80 feet long and 16 feet 6 inches wide at her greatest beam, and carried mast and sail. The Needham ship is 75 feet in length, with a beam of 10 feet 6 inches, and had no mast. Both are very flat amidships, and have very fine or sharp ends, but it is evident that in proportion to her length, the Gokstad boat had a much greater beam. That was because she was a sailing ship, and the Needham vessel was not. The latter may fairly be assumed to have been a skuta, and the Gokstad ship a rather small serpent. Now, in all the sagas that have come down to us, the different warships which occupy so prominent a place in them are distinguished as to size by the number of oars they pulled. From the Needham ship, which had 14 oars a side, we are thus able to judge the dimensions of famous Viking warships, like the Long Serpent of King Olaf and others, if we allow for the slightly wider space between the rowers' benches, necessitated by the greater length of the oars in the larger vessels. Of course, the whole length of the ship was not occupied by the benches. In the Needham ship, for instance, they took up 46 feet of her length. The remaining 15 feet at each end were required for fighting and steering platforms, stowage of stores, etc. In this way, it has been calculated that the Long Serpent — you must remember that this was a special Long Serpent, and probably bigger than the usual run of the war vessels so called — was 180 feet long, while the still bigger ship belonging to our King Canute works out at no less than 300 feet in length. The beam or width it has not been found possible to estimate exactly, but my own opinion is that the lines or contour of these very much bigger ships were much deeper and fuller than in the smaller types. There is an old manuscript in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, dating from about AD 1000, in which appear 3 pictures of Noah's Ark. The house part of the design is frankly impossible. It would capsize the ship. But the hull in each case, the boat part, is not at all unlike the well-known Bayeux tapestry ships, but of a better and more seaworthy shape, though in some of them the big dragon figurehead is unduly exaggerated. The space between the benches was called a room, and the port and starboard positions of this were known as half-rooms. The crew were all told off to these half-rooms as their stations, except those quartered forward and aft. Thus the Long Serpent had 8 men to each half-room, and from this item of information, it has been estimated that she carried a crew of something between 600 and 700 men. Goodness knows how many King Canute's big dreadnought carried. Some of these Viking ships were very smartly decorated. Armorial bearings had not then been invented, but their sails were worked with the most beautiful emblematic and intricate embroidery, and were not infrequently made of velvet, though generally of a coarse woolen material called vodmal. Some of the most elaborate ones were actually lined with fur. Not only the ships themselves, but also their sails, like the swords of their warriors, were given poetical-sounding names: the cloth of the wind, the beard of the yard, and the tapestry of the masthead, are some of them. Along their gunwales above the oars, which worked through holes in the ship's side, ran the shield row, composed of circular wooden shields or targets, with big shining bosses of brass or other metal in the middle. Each shield overlapped the next till it touched its boss, and so gave a double protection to the rowers. This was a very ancient custom, as shields were carried in this way by Phoenician ships as far back as 450 BC. As a general rule, the Norsemen's shields were black and yellow, the Danes red, and the Saxons white with red or blue edges. It is rather curious that, with the exception of black, these colors are conspicuous in the flags of the corresponding nations of today. But the King of Norway presented our King Athelstan in 931 with a ship fitted with a complete row of golden shields. A whole chapter might be written about the figureheads of the Viking ships, for they were much more than mere ornaments. They each had some special signification, and were certainly connected with a most extraordinary superstition which prevailed among the Scandinavian peoples. It is best explained by an example from the saga of which one Egil was the hero. Pursued by a king answering to the suggestive name of Bloodaxe, he escaped from Norway and took ship to Iceland. Before he set sail over the North Sea, he determined to take it out of his enemy Bloodaxe by a species of what we may call wireless witchcraft. Landing on an islet, he erected what was known as a nithstang, a contraption considered very pleasing to the Norse gods. The idea probably had something in common with the lifting up of the brazen serpent in the Book of Numbers. His installation was a very simple one, a hazel pole with a horse's head stuck on the top. He stuck it up in a crevice of the rocks, saying that he did so as a curse on Bloodaxe and his queen. Then he turned it round so as to point to the mainland, and announced that he also fired off his curse at the guardian spirits of the country, who were to get no rest till they had hustled King Bloodaxe out of it. Finally, he inscribed his curse in runic characters on the pole, and continued his voyage to Iceland as pleased with himself as a German hero who had dropped a floating mine in the track of passenger vessels. Now it appears that these same guardian spirits were extremely susceptible to this sort of wireless, not only in Norway, but everywhere. And it also seems that, how or in what way I am unable to explain, the figureheads of the Viking ships had much the same properties as the nithstangs. So it was that in Iceland, at any rate, there was a law that ships must remove their figureheads before approaching the land, and not approach it with gaping heads and yawning snouts, lest they might scare the guardian spirits of the land. Having carried out this regulation, it was customary for the seamen to hoist a polished shield to the masthead, and so flash the signal that the guardian spirits need not now be alarmed. That some connection existed between these heads and the nithstang is further shown by a drawing in an old manuscript of that period, which depicts a human head set on a pole, which is fastened to a dragon figurehead. And again in a wall painting in the church of Tegelsmora in Upland, in which the famous King Olaf is seen waging a desperate battle with our old nursery friends, the trolls. The bowsprit of his ship is adorned with the skull of an ox. But we must leave the ships and come to their crews. To begin with, they were all soldiers and sailors too. They were equally at home on the battlefield ashore and in handling their cherished longships afloat. The Scandinavians believed that the soul of a warrior killed in battle went at once to Valhalla, which represented their idea of heaven. There they confidently expected that the brave fighter would spend a happy eternity of fighting and feasting. It is said that their remote forefathers had brought this weird form of belief from the depths of Central Asia, but that must be a very old story. But fighting was the breath of their life. They reveled in it, though they did not despise the plunder which was generally the reward of victory. Many of these fierce warriors were subject to and even cultivated a species of madness, almost amounting to demoniacal possession, which induced them to tear off their clothes and hurl themselves almost naked into the fray, feeling endued with the strength of 7 men. These berserkers, as they were called from this custom, were doubtless most dangerous opponents in their berserk fury. Nowadays, it is generally accepted that the braver the man, the more modest he is about his deeds of valor. The boaster is considered likely to be but a broken reed in the day of battle. But it was quite otherwise with the Viking warriors. They gloried in boasting aloud of their prowess, of the deeds they had done, and of those that they were ready to perform. The tactics of the Vikings, if they failed to ram their opponents, was to lash the bows of as many friendly and hostile vessels together as possible, so as to form a floating battlefield. The fighting platforms were not apparently raised above the bows, as later on in medieval times. They were somewhat about the level of the gunwale, and when several ships were lashed together, all these platforms provided a battleground upon which the berserker and his emulators could indulge in the furious hand-to-hand combats which were their delight. If they could do this, they were probably more than pleased that they had failed to ram their enemy. I doubt if every ship was built with a ram, but on the other hand, it is certain that some ships were specially built for use as rams, and even strengthened by iron plating, so that we see that the armor-clad is no new invention. In the larger longships, a fighting gangway ran along behind the shield row, connecting the fore and after platforms. Beneath the latter, which was somewhat elevated so that the steersman could look ahead, was the sleeping place for the commander of the ship. Other sleeping accommodation was provided under the foremost platform, while, if at anchor, those of the crew who were not on watch slept under awnings or tents, set up on framework which could be erected for the purpose in the center of the vessel. The men slept in leather bags, which were equally useful either ashore or afloat. In short, these ancient war vessels were so well and scientifically built, so well arranged and equipped, so well manned, that we cease to wonder at the long voyages they were able to perform by taking advantage of the summer months. There is not the slightest doubt that the Vikings discovered the continent of America long before Columbus did. They went by way of Iceland, and so were able to touch land more than once on their journeys, but they got there all the same. They established a colony in Greenland about AD 985. From there, they made several expeditions to the southward and discovered a densely wooded country, which is supposed to have been some portion of Nova Scotia. The climate of Greenland must have been very different from what it is at present, for the Viking colony lasted for 400 years, till in the 15th century, an enormous mass of ice was swept down by the Arctic current, piled itself up along the coast, and entirely cut off the settlement, which at that time consisted of 30 villages with their churches and monasteries from the rest of the world, so that before long every trace of it had disappeared. It seems possible that some of you may say, "This is all very interesting, but I thought we were going to read about the British Navy." And it seems to me that the Saxons and their ships represented the British Navy of those days. That is a fair argument, but for my part, I do not think that we can accept the Saxon Navy as the ancestor of the British Navy of today. The Saxons were no seamen, and apparently but poor soldiers. When King Alfred built a navy of ships, which are stated to have been superior in every way to those of the Frisians, Scandinavians, and Danes, and by means of which he succeeded in securing more than one victory, he could not provide them with seamen. The Saxons were no good, and he had to hire Frisian pirates to man them. The Saxons fought well at Hastings, but though there was a strong infusion of the Danish element by this time, they lost the battle through lack of discipline and military experience. It is difficult, therefore, to recognize in these Saxons the progenitors of men like Lieutenant Holbrook, who navigated his submarine through and under rows and rows of deadly mines, knowing that the least touch would bring annihilation, or of Private Pym of the Berkshires, who alone and on his own rushed into a house held by a detachment of German soldiers and succeeded in killing the whole of them but 3, who made their escape. No, for the ancestors of the British seamen and sailors of Elizabethan and modern times, I think we should rather look to the Danes, who, it must be remembered, between 870 and the Norman Conquest, were not only continually invading England, but established themselves in a great part of it, especially in the east and north, and to those of the Conqueror's followers, who traced their descent directly from the Norsemen or Vikings. It is their spirit which has brought us victory both by land and by sea, but more especially by sea, and not the spirit of Alfred's Saxon subjects, who had to pay others to fight for them. Again, take such preeminent commanders as Drake and Nelson. Is not the former name one which takes us directly back to the Drakers? the dragon ships of the Vikings? And has not Nilsen a distinctly Danish sound about it? The ships of King Alfred were full nigh twice as long as the others. Some had 60 oars, and some had more. They were both swifter and steadier, and also higher than the others. They were shapen neither like the Frisian nor the Danish, but so it seemed to him that they would be most efficient. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from the British Navy book, a work that traces the history of the British Navy from pre-Roman times to World War I. I found that more interesting than I expected to, but I say that about a lot of these works, don't I? I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thank you so much for joining me. Until our next boring book, good night.